So I just want to start off with a couple questions. They're all, what do you like better questions. So there's no need to answer out loud, just think about them to yourself. We'll start off with an easy one. What do you like better, Congress or zombies? Actually, let's move on to another one. What do you like better, Congress or witches? And not just those cute little smart Hermione witches, those wicked witch of the West witches. And this is my personal favorite. What do you like better, Congress or hemorrhoids? I bet you, I mean, you're glad that I didn't have pictures for this one. And so, if you're a representative of the American population as a whole, statistically speaking, 43% of you prefer zombies to Congress. 46% of you prefer witches, and a whopping 53% of you, that's a majority, prefer hemorrhoids to Congress. So that's obviously a huge problem. People hate Congress. And why is that? Well, it's just because they just can't get anything done, right? And the bigger question here is why? Why is this? Because just 2 decades ago, Congress's approval rating was 50 points higher. And as the saying goes, usually the answer is just the simplest one, and that is voting. Voting is the easiest way to make your voice heard, yet in midterm elections, like the one coming up this year, less than 35% of eligible voters participate. Congress's inability to pass effective legislation of any kind has led to a decrease in voting among those ordinary people like you and me, moderates. Why vote if it doesn't matter, right? And this means politicians are voted in only by extremes, because moderates just can't stand their choices, the choices that they have. And when extremes vote, they vote only for other extremes, right? And so thus we enter a vicious circle. At top we have extremes voting for other extremes, extreme politicians refusing to work with each other, right? That means they can't pass anything, which creates further apathy in the political system, which turns off even more ordinary people, right? Polarization breeds apathy. I mean, how many times have you heard anyone, parents, relatives, friends, my dad in the back there, complain about politics, right, all the time? Oh, my damn taxes are too high. All these wars are screwing us up. Global warming is just going to kill you, Ashil. Yeah, right? And then election day comes. I'm like, hey, who'd you vote for? And they're like, gotcha. I didn't vote. I'm too busy, right? So, I mean, come on. At the core, democracy requires us to actively engage in it. It demands daily participation in order to be successful, and we just don't see that today. Today, we see commentators childishly bicker on cable news. We see facts seemingly created out of thin air, and we see a breakdown of trust in one another and in the system. So now more than ever, it's easy to just curl up in a ball and cry, and trust me, I've tried. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. But only in darkness do you see the stars. The key question that we have to ask is, how do we break out of this vicious cycle, right? And the answer, it has to be us as in the youth, you guys right there, and I guess me too. We must lead the charge to take back democracy from those who seek to manipulate it according to their wishes, right? So keeping this question in mind, we'll get to in a moment. I'd like to take a moment to think about something. How can we teens overcome the institutional barriers that prevent us from political involvement and creating clear, lasting change? And so for some inspiration to this answer, let's look to the past. The pattern of young people working to fix adults' mistakes is nothing new in our country's history, and might I add, adults' bitter hostility, virulence, and sometimes hatred of the change that youth are bringing to this country is nothing new either. We can go all the way back. Let's take a trip back over 100 years, 1899, when a group of newspaper boys, literal 12-year-olds, started a union of over 3,000 people to protest new child labor laws. They took on 2 of the most powerful media moguls in the world, William Randall Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. In one confrontation, a literal brawl broke out between a group of the newspaper boys and then a couple of men who were hired to replace them. The boys won. Let's skip ahead 50 years. And that's when teens and young adults really burst onto the national scene. 1957, 9 teenagers, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. They enrolled in a little high school in Arkansas. They were the first black kids ever in that school. One girl had acid thrown into her eyes. Another, flaming pieces of paper dropped onto her from above while she was in the bathroom. They were spat on. They were called the worst names in the English language. And they were just, absolutely hated. And they later became known as the Little Rock Nine. So teens were instrumental in the civil rights movement, the Greensboro Sit-In, the March on Washington, Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in Birmingham. Children were tear gassed, attacked by dogs, and blasted with fire hoses. Now let's go even further. Let's take it a few more years. 1970, Kent State University this time, protests over the Vietnam War. Unarmed students were killed, tear gassed, and abused by police, protesting the Vietnam War. Now let's skip ahead 2 more decades, right? 2 more decades, this time Tiananmen Square. In Tiananmen Square, I don't know if you guys know this, but there are estimated 100,000 students there protesting the censorship laws in China, as well as communism there, and a couple thousand soldiers. They were armed with tanks and rifles. They opened fire on those kids, and thousands were estimated to be killed. And now, 2 decades later, 2018, we're at the present, Parkland, Florida. Let's look at that example, right? Survivors of a massacre were called, quote, crisis actors. A candidate for Maine state legislator called Emma Gonzalez, a, quote, skinhead lesbian, right? So I've arrived at this conclusion that, a lot of adults aren't going to like, and that's that adults love to talk the talk, but they hate to walk the walk. What do I mean by this? Teens and youth are heralded as brilliant, passionate, optimistic, but it seems that whenever they try to put those talents to use, they're just shot down by any means necessary by adults, sometimes quite literally. Let's take, for example, Malala. She was heralded as a girl who's going to bring education to millions of poor girls around the world. She was literally shot in the face by the Taliban. And so this brings me back to the question I asked earlier. How do we overcome those institutionalized barriers to progress? And like before, the answer is quite simple. First, we need to recognize the movements I mentioned earlier, they were all successful. Civil rights, Vietnam, even Tiananmen Square to an extent. My point is, at the core, we need to have hope that our efforts will be successful. Second, we need to view democracy not as a once-a-year engagement on Election Day, but a daily activity that requires active, not passive participation. All right, Ashil, so how do I engage in democracy every day? Simple things, reading the news, listening to the radio, if anyone does that anymore, signing a petition, talking to government officials, learning about the basic structure of our government. I can't stress this enough, guys. Listening to other people's opinions. Debate is elementary to democracy, and by limiting your worldview only to the bubble that Facebook or Twitter creates, not only just feeds that confirmation bias, but adds to that polarization that we established was the main problem in the first place. And so, finally, if we're going to go out, if we're going to, as the youth, try to affect change, we need to protest with a purpose. What does that mean? Pick an issue, gather support, and don't stop until you get what you want. Quite simple. All too often, protests are devoid of clear messaging, characterized by incomplete organization, and as a result, fail to galvanize the public support needed to spur the action. And so that brings me to that last example that I mentioned, here today, 2018, Parkland, Florida. That March for Our Lives movement isn't making these mistakes, and that's what makes me so optimistic that this time we will see real change. All the actions taken, the tweets, the petitions, the protests, the rallies on CNN, screaming, they're all singularly focused on invigorating the public for elections. They have a clear message, a central organization, and they are ruthless in leaving behind anything that deviates from their goal. And from this, I've learned we need more diverse youth in running for office, actually, and adults not discounting the potential that we teens have to change the world. And finally, an empowerment among kids that their opinions matter. Be the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you so much for sticking around. My name is Ashil. Have a good one.